Curran, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There have been some very good contributions to the second reading debate of this bill, particularly by my two colleagues, David Parker and Phil Goff. And I also want to particularly acknowledge the contribution of Russell Norman last week in the debate on this. Sadly, though, Mr Speaker, there's been some very poor contributions, the worst of them being by the National Party MP David Bennett, who last week unleashed a deeply personal attack on Phil Goff, also on Labour, New Zealand First and the Greens, and who couldn't string an argument together, so resorted to juvenile name-calling. And it's members like that give this Parliament and the debate in this House and politics in general a bad name. Mr Speaker, I want to just touch on the two main points that David Parker made in his contribution, which are relevant to my contribution. This is the only time that we get to debate this free trade agreement in this Parliament. And so the quality of the debate is very important, and I think the quality from the Labour side and the Greens and New Zealand First has been very thoughtful and willing to engage in a debate. Unfortunately, I haven't seen a lot of that from the other side. Labour supports this bill, Mr Speaker, because we have come to the conclusion that on balance it's about right. And the thing about this is, Mr Speaker, that really annoys the government is that Labour has negotiated better trade agreements than them, and we are prepared to stand up and clearly articulate our bottom lines and to say what we will support and what we won't support, and to have a lot of credibility behind that. And that really annoys the government, and that's why you get the likes of David Bennett, who really couldn't come up with an argument, so just hurled abuse. The Labour Party accepts that the South Korean Free Trade Agreement does substantially reduce the tariffs which are currently faced by New Zealand exporters to South Korea, and that our exporters currently suffer substantial disadvantages when competing with sellers to South Korea from other countries that pay lower tariffs, because their earlier trade agreements have already reduced tariffs. That's the basis for the main basis for our support, and we support growing our trade, and we support exports. And I'd just like to, and this is another thing that the National Party aren't that good at, and that is growing the percentage of exports. And just today, it's been revealed that the ratio of exports to GDP is its lowest since 1997. The target being 40% of GDP, right now it's at just 28%. So really not much to write home again. And if you are going to take advantage of these free trade agreements, then really you've got to put the effort in behind the scenes to be boosting the industries that are exporting. And I'm a champion of the tech export industry, Mr Speaker, which accounts for about 7% of our GDP and more than 124,000 jobs and a growth of 16.5% a year. But we could be doing a lot more to grow jobs in this sector. In particular, I'd just like to touch on the video gaming industry sector, which is one of our fastest growing tech sector. 83% of that sector is exported, and all that they could do with just a little bit of help from this government, such as getting the post-production digital and visual effects scheme incentive qualifying for that rebate, that 20% rebate, which they can't get access to. That's something that this government could be doing. We acknowledge the concerns of submitters on this bill. We won't blindly support free trade agreements like this government does, but we also won't blindly oppose them, and we negotiate good ones and point out the flaws. We know that there's been a botch up in this bill, but we say that on balance that we support it. Our biggest concern is the lack of engagement with civil society.
I call Jono Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise and take